We are joined now by Pat Buchanan, the sage of McLean, and, of course, syndicated columnist, author. Pat, thanks for being here.
Good to talk with you, Raymond.
Pat, what do you make of the meltdown that we seem to be seeing from the Democratic Party, really in the wake, and you referenced this in your article this week, No Party for Old White Men. Give me a sense of what that's about and why we're seeing the meltdown we're seeing among the Democratic activists.
Well, first, you ought to take a look at the Washington Post today. They got a quote by Barack Obama who says they're tearing their hair out. Take it easy, you guys. Mm-hmm. Look, they had a very bad week, Raymond. The Democrats did. The so-called Muslim ban was upheld. Public employee unions can't extort fees from workers. They have to win them over. You got the opening on the Supreme Court. You've got all of these things taking place, and now you've got a real panic, and there's talk in the Democratic Party now they want to abolish ICE.
We've been talking about that all morning. It's unbelievable.
Which means that, if the Border Patrol doesn't get them, doesn't capture them, I don't care if it's MS-13, they're here. Nobody can go after them. It's an act of insanity. And it's amazing the language they're using. They feel, Trump had a bad week, they felt, when you had the families divided down on the border, and all of a sudden he's had these succession of victories, and there's real panic in the Democratic Party, and you saw it with Bill Maher and with Michael Moore. So I think what's going to happen, is Trump had a very good week.
Yeah. What is the impact, Pat, of this 28-year-old socialist who really knocked Joe Crowley, who was a member of the Democratic leadership, out of his seat in Queens? What does this portend? The New York Times had that piece this weekend, the coming millennial socialists, where they see this wave of socialist young candidates for office. Is that a possibility? Is that the direction of things?
Here's the thing and she said so. She said so yesterday on TV. What's it, Ocasio-Lopez?
Yeah.
Yeah, look, in her district there was a 13% turnout, and Crowley, it's only a 18% white district now. It used to be about 58% when Crowley was elected, but they've given him the North Bronx or the South Bronx, as well as Queens, and these are very much occupied by third world immigrant folks. And they overwhelmed Crowley, and Crowley had no organization. Obviously, as everything's atrophied up there. But exactly, she is going to pull the party to the left. She pulled Crowley. He denounced ICE. Here's basically a Tip O'Neill Democrat denounced ICE as fascist. You've got the other night Miss Nixon up there, who's running against the governor of New York. What did she call it? A terrorist organization. You're talking about Americans who are protecting the United States from MS-13, who are rounding up illegal immigrants who are beating their wives and driving drunk and killing people. They do all this dangerous and tough work to protect the country from people who have broken the law, broke into the country, and are committing crimes, and they're denouncing them as though they were brown shirts.
Yeah, well, and trying to cast them as such. I mean, when you've got the Vox founder saying to Ben Shapiro, this is a Jew who puts other Jews on the train. I mean, we're in a very dangerous spot here, Pat, where I worry about the rhetoric, the level of rhetoric.
Are you exactly right? Look, if we're actually talking about fascists and you're talking about terrorists and all of these terms, these are terms really that advocate violence to prevent what's happening. And when you're talking about getting 1 million people around the Capitol, I don't think Michael Moore can get that kind of crowd out, and him and his friends. But when you're talking about doing that, you're talking about replacing the democratic process of getting votes in the Senate or losing votes in the Senate with one of quasi-intimidation and violence to get your objectives done in what is supposed to be a democratic republic. I think the political reality of this, and Trump has picked up on it, is, look, if the American people perceive this type of conduct as now the legitimate measures of the American left and the new radical Democratic Party, they are risking all the gains that they think they're going to make in November.
We're talking to Pat Buchanan. Pat, you being a student of history and indeed an observer and participant in it, tell me how this moment in your mind, when we see the rise of Antifa, we see candidates being propelled, like Orsacio in Queens. She was endorsed. She's a Democratic socialist, endorsed by MoveOn.org, Black Lives Matter, People for Bernie. When you see the rise of this kind of take to the street anarchic mobs, does this put you in mind at all of the Nixon era? And
Sure,
might Trump learn a lesson from that era?
Well, it puts you in mind of 1968, 69, 70, 71. When you had 68, of course, when Dr. King was shot, you had 100 cities burning and National Guard, federal troops, machine guns on the Capitol. I mean, 7th Street, 14th Street in D.C., which are now, sort of yuppified or whatever they call it, millennialized now. All of these places were on fire and burned and gutted. And you had not only the riots, you had anti-war demonstrations that shut down every campus after Kent State. There were about 900 campuses. All this violence, you had bombings virtually every day. So it was much more violent back then. But the language and the hostility were pretty much the same. Some like Bobby Kennedy and others were making statements about, if you got Adlai Stevenson said a criminal record will be something to be proud of in the future politics, etc. And they led into this sort of riotous time. And what happened was the whole country, Middle America, and especially the Nixon-Agnew Democrats, Northern Catholics from districts like Queens, and all the Southern Protestants who had voted Democratic all through FDR and Wilson, they all swept into Nixon's party and crushed McGovern 49 states to 1. As I used to say back in those days, if we hadn't botched that break-in, we would have gotten Massachusetts.
Pat, what do you make of the rise that we're seeing in this new Mexican election over the weekend? Again, a socialist candidate there, for whatever anybody wants to say about Nieto, he was at least a market guy that you could deal with.
Well, you're talking about a
now,
socialist here.
With somebody who claims they're going to clean up corruption.
Well, this is
right?
This guy comes out of that party, the PRI. I mean, they're very hardline leftists, almost quasi-Marxist and socialist, and those are his roots. He ran twice before and lost. But I think you're going to see more of that. And in the whole, one of the things that's good about Mexico is that it has turned basically to the center in terms of economics. And it's done a lot of good for the Mexican people over the last 20, 30 years. They've prospered as they never have before. And frankly, they got the benefits of all our lost factories that moved down there and moved into the border. What did they used to call that? Tequila, what was that? I forget the phrase they had for the border area where Maquiladora, where they had all the factories from the United States. And so now, but if you get this socialist in there and he reverts to what he was, I think you're going to have a dramatic increase in people coming across the American border, and you're going to have a real measure of hostility. During his campaign, he said, the whole world, they have a right to go to the United States. Now, he doesn't do a job of securing his half of the border to the degree he can. You're going to have real problems with Donald J. Trump.
Mm-hmm. No, I see a looming showdown between these two. This isn't going to work because at least Nieto was attempting to, and again, they're great at enforcing immigration. The Mexicans are,
Sure,
and they were doing a decent job, but not well enough.
Exactly. Well, I think migrating illegally into Mexico is, I believe, a felony, and they're very hard line on it when they want to be and have to be. But what they've been doing is looking the other way as these coyotes and others bring these folks up to the American people and push them across, where suddenly all the legal processes take effect. And the Americans have to prove they're not legitimate asylum seekers and send them back after a period of time. Of course, that's where we get into the whole family division thing. So, I mean,
Right.
if you don't have cooperation with those folks along the southern 2,000-mile border, we've got an added problem.
Yep. What do you make of President Obama's comments? And you referenced them earlier, where he said last night, "If we don't do something about this president, I will." What do you make of that?
I mean, are we headed for the OK Corral? What is going on here?
I don't know what I don't with all the talk
What
of,
are you saying?
of you know we got to ice him out, and who knows what they're talking about.
I think, and I take a benign view, I think he's saying that I will bring my full oratorical powers to battle against him in the fall election, which is fine.
Mm-hmm.
He's got a legitimate right to do that. I don't know what else he'd be talking about unless he and Michael Moore are working together.
They're going to go do a human blockade around the Capitol and the White House.
Yeah,
Who
they
knows?
did a lot of that.
But
I remember all those sit-ins and lie-ins and all that stuff.
right. Well, you know how this rolls, Pat. But here's the problem with all of this.
Over again, as Yogi Berra said.
Right, but you know, there does seem to be this appetite on the left now because of the ineffectiveness of their leadership, and as you point out in your column, all these guys are, you know, they've been around for 30 and 40 years. Some of the leadership here, Steny Hoyer and Nancy Pelosi. So they're now looking, it seems, the Democrat activists, the young people, are looking to these socialists. Might this moment, and even Trump's presence and the success of Trump, push them further to the left and marginalize the Democratic Party even further?
Exactly. Now, you take some history. I remember back, and I go back a long way, when Nixon, we felt, should have won the election against JFK. And, you know, and he hadn't handled it with any great campaign, and it was very narrow and we lost. We decided, look, we're going to nominate one of our own. And I was all behind from as soon as Nixon lost in '60. I was behind Barry Goldwater. So we took the party right in a run to the right and out at the Cow Palace, you know, called Nelson Rockefeller all the names you can imagine, and nominated Goldwater, and it didn't work out that well. We lost 44 states to 6, you know, and so, but then we moved around and we came back to Nixon in '68. But the Democrats did the same thing. They felt Humphrey should have won the election against Nixon, and the left, Bobby Kennedy, of course, had been shot 2 months earlier, McGovern and McCarthy at the convention, and you had that crowd out in this Grant Park. And the Democratic Party said the reason we lost is we didn't follow our real beliefs, which are deeply McGovernite. And this new crowd came in and threw out the old crowd and nominated McGovern, and they lost 49 states. So there's a trend of parties to do this. Once they lose a tight election they think they should have won, they say the centrists, the establishment blew it, and it's our turn now. And I think we're moving exactly in that direction. It looks to me, and you know, you can't take the Crowley district as exactly a replica of what's going to happen, but there's no doubt it's where the party is going. The ones with the fire and energy. Look, ever since that lady and the young gal with Ocasio Lopez, ever since she came out and said, you know, we ought to abolish ICE, Cynthia Nixon said it, and Crowley has said it, and now Gillibrand has said it, and now Elizabeth Warren. These are presidential candidates who are saying get rid of the only agency that defends us against criminal aliens in our midst.
Unbelievable. No, it's unbelievable. Very quickly, Pat, before we run out of time, the president has a monumental appointment to make in the next few days. His nominee to replace Justice Anthony Kennedy. Who do you think would fit the bill in this moment? It looks like Brett Kavanaugh on the D.C. Circuit, Amy Barrett, who is that Notre Dame professor who was chastised for her Catholicism, who's on the Seventh Circuit, that those are the most likely picks. There are 5 that I saw on a list. Who do you think makes the most sense at this moment? Well,
they had one there from, I saw, I mean, he's not in the 5, but he may be in the 7, from Western Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh. And he apparently was I don't know whether he was a truck driver or something as a young guy, but he really came up from a tough
Thomas
background.
Hardiman.
Yeah, exactly. He sounded good, but they all, to me, I mean, I will say the Republican Party is now, they've moved to where They are succeeding where we failed with Nixon. As I wrote in my book, we picked, we got Berger, and then we Hainsworth and Carswell chopped to pieces by the Democrats on the Hill. So Nixon, follows Berger's lead and names Harry Blackmun to the Supreme Court. And the only good one we named, or great one we named, was Rehnquist. And all of them, Nixon made the mistake, and Reagan made mistakes with Sandra Day O'Connor and Kennedy, in my view. And Bush 1 made mistakes with Souter, a disaster. And so I think now they've got it down cold with this Federalist Society. I'm immensely impressed with these guys and the work they do and vetting these people all the way up and down, as we failed to do.
Mm-hmm. No, it's been impressive. Somebody mentioned to me the other day, Amy Barrett makes the most sense, because if you're going to toy at all with Roe v. Wade, better to have a woman in the majority.